Hi everyone. Today I'll be comparing various cameras against each other in terms of ISO performance because I get a lot of questions, is the Mark III better than the Mark II, or is APS-C or full frame better than Micro Four Thirds? And I have my own opinions about that, and I have a pretty high tolerance for high ISO noise regardless of camera. But that being said, I decided rather than give you my opinion, I'm just going to take out all the cameras I have, take some pictures at the various ISOs and compare them against each other and show them to you, and you can make that call for yourself. All right, so let me give you the basics here. I have several Olympus cameras, but I narrowed it down to the E-M1 Mark II and Mark III, the E-M10 Mark II. Because I do have an E-M5 Mark II and a Pen F and a Pen PL8, but all of those cameras performed exactly the same as, indistinguishable to my eye with the E-M10 Mark II. So the E-M10 Mark II is going to represent. The only Panasonic camera I have is the Panasonic GX85, which is, pretty equivalent to the E-M10 Mark II in terms of release date and age and technology. Also, I have the Fujifilm X-T30, which is a fairly recent camera from Fujifilm, and the Nikon D750, of course, still a very highly regarded camera, and I think it's still competitive today in the full frame market in terms of, image quality and noise performance, etc. So those are the cameras. Now, basically, I'm going to be using the same lens on all of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, and I'm using the 18-55 kit lens with the Fujifilm and a 35mm f2 on the Nikon D750, just to keep the equivalent full field of view between all of the cameras. And of course, I'll be fixing the ISO to be the same on all the cameras. The aperture is going to be at f5.6 on all the cameras. And the shutter speed is pretty close across, if not exactly the same. There'll be some variances, but it's not really going to affect the results that much in this case, in this kind of testing. So let's go into the scene and let's talk about that. Okay, so this is what I set up, and it's a fairly low light scene because if you look at the shutter speed of 0.8 seconds at 5.6 ISO 200, I did this at night just because I wanted to push the cameras a little bit. And then for the comparison, I'm going to be focusing here on the color card so you can see the noise across the colors. And then I'm going to focus right here onto the coffee grinder and this black camera so that you can kind of see the noise in the shadow areas. And then I'm going to focus in right here against sort of the bokeh area where it's a little smoother, and sometimes it's easier to see the noise there and how it affects, just the background. I'll be using the E-M1 Mark III as my base camera, as you can see here on the left with the model number and the ISO, and then on the right side will be the competing camera and its model number and ISO. And we'll be moving pretty fast, so you may want to pause the screen if you want to see a particular camera at a particular ISO. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we'll be moving on to ISO 800, and still I think the images are pretty similar, but there are some big differences in the color sciences between the cameras. Remember, these are the raw images. Okay, so as you can see, up to ISO 800, I don't think there was really a significant other than in the color signs, but let's move on to ISO 1600, where you'll start to see some subtle differences. Now we're up to 6400, so now it gets real, right? Now, what's interesting here is that it's more obvious than ever that even though these two cameras have the same shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, D750 is still a bit brighter than the E-M10 Mark III. And if we look at the Fuji, I had to dial in +1 EV to get the same shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. However, Fuji looks a little bit darker, doesn't it, in some areas, but then a little brighter in other areas. Definitely a strong red-orange kind of tint to color sign. Okay, so let's move on to ISO 12800. Okay, now we're at the maximum ISO for the Micro Four Thirds cameras. Let's take a look. Alright, and just for fun, we'll compare the Fujifilm X-T30 against the Nikon D750 at ISO 51000. Alright, and that was the end of the raw comparisons. And you know, I think up to about 6400, they were all pretty acceptable, you know, for me. And honestly, I could even go to 25,600 on most of them, if not all of them. But you know, even as a professional, you know, we don't deliver our images as raw files, right? We process them and give the clients JPEGs. So that being said, what I want to do is just test the camera's JPEG output. Because the cameras do some noise reduction when they create the JPEG in the camera, even when you turn off the noise reduction. So I turned off the noise reduction on all of the cameras, either turned them off or set it to -4, you know, whatever the setting is. And I wanted you to see the JPEG output at ISO 6400. And then you can kind of extrapolate from there at different ISOs. But I think 6400 is a reasonable ISO to test. So I think the in-camera JPEG processing did a good job of taking out a lot of that color noise, even though I turned off all the noise reduction in the camera. And, you know, it brought the images a lot closer together, especially if you're going to print or put on Instagram or something. You really won't be able to tell the difference between any of those in a blind test, I don't think. But again, you know, there's the images straight out of camera. You can draw your own conclusions. Now, another thing I'm working on is a dynamic range test. And something kind of surprised me. I'm just going to give you a little taste. Because I was comparing the E-M10 Mark III against the Nikon D750, and I wanted to see how many of the highlights I can save. So let me show you that. So here I have the E-M10 Mark III at the base ISO 200, and then on the right the D750 at its base ISO 100, and then the shutter speed is doubled on the 750 as it should be, right, to get the same exposure. But it still looks a little brighter to me. But what surprised me was when I wanted to see how much of the highlights I could recover from each of these cameras. So what I did was I just dialed in -5 EV like so. And I'll do the same thing on the Nikon like so. And then let's pick one of the highlights here, like this lens barrel. And you can see the E-M10 Mark III really saved the highlights here. And then on the D750, they are totally clipped. Almost everywhere in the image, like down here. Look at the top of this pen PL8. And then all the way in the back here as well. The lens barrel still looks good. I can still see the text here, but on this camera, yeah, it's all clipped up here. So, you know, I need to work on my methodology a little bit. But I'm going to try and put this together for you in my next video. But if you have any questions about this video or any of my cameras, leave them in the comments below. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.